in the century between the late 17th and late 18th centuries, the broader European universe, let's say, underwent a mission to take the accumulated knowledge that they had inherited from centuries past and push it forward, to explore, record, systematize, and disseminate knowledge was the particular motivation behind what has become known in Europe as the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. And from that, we can look at the earlier era, which is the Renaissance. As one of the principal figures of that is the writer Machiavelli, political scientist, whatever you want to call him. And in a very famous letter to his friend Francesco Vettori, he describes his average day in exile. When evening comes, I return home and go into my study. On the threshold, I strip off my muddy, sweaty workday clothes and put on the robes of court and palace, and in this graver dress I enter the antique courts of the ancients and am welcomed by them. And there I taste the food that alone is mine and for which I was born. And there I make bold to speak to them and ask the motives of their actions, and they, in their humanity, reply to me. And for the space of 4 hours I forget the world, remember no vexation, fear poverty no more, tremble no more at death. I pass indeed into their world. Now, he's talking about reading books here, but notice the transportation, notice the giving oneself over, the surrendering to this fantasy of living among the ancients. He is putting on perhaps Roman garb. He's probably sitting around in a toga and sitting there and reading these geniuses of the classical age and putting himself in that faraway time, which is where he kind of wants to be. That's his mental happy space. Now, consider that, but just push it forward 100 years or so to the era of the philosopher René Descartes, who describes a similar phenomenon, but in a very specific difference in the way they look at things. Descartes says, conversing with the ancients is much like traveling. It is good to know something of the customs of various peoples in order to judge our own more objectively, and so that we do not make the same mistake of the untraveled in supposing that everything contrary to our customs is ridiculous and irrational. But when one spends too much time traveling, one becomes at last a stranger at home. And those who are too interested in things which occurred in past centuries are often remarkably ignorant of what is going on today. That is Enlightenment thought. The difference is striking. Notice how with Machiavelli, he is giving himself over. He is seeking transport. He is living a kind of classical era fever dream in his letter. Here, in the Discourse on Method, René Descartes is saying it's good to know these things, but he is keeping his objective cool. He is not looking for transport. He is looking to very objectively go touring through the ancient minds, not dispelling them completely, not yet, but to cultivate from them a few of the worthwhile ideas. Notice how the emphasis is on today. With Machiavelli, he wants to return to the past. Here, Descartes is voicing his age's interest in the modern day, the current day. He's not so interested in venerating the past, in venerating the ancients, but rather in seeing, well, what can they do for me now? And if they can do something, if I can glean something from those old books, fantastic. If not, too bad, see you later. He is very much a man of the now, and that is the Enlightenment. Fixing the now, solving the problems of now, not sitting there and saying, "Oh, well, that's how the people of the past would have done it, or that's what the people of the past valued." No, he is concerned with, well, does it have any significance now? That's the Enlightenment. Immanuel Kant was a little bit more blunt about his approach to the past and talked about the need for humanity to reject their parents and to grow up. Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large part of mankind gladly remain minors all their lives, long after nature had freed them from external guidance. They are the reasons why it is so easy for others to set themselves up as guardians. It is so comfortable to be a minor. If I have a book that thinks for me, a pastor who acts as my conscience, a physician who prescribes my diet, and so on, then I have no need to exert myself. I have no need to think. Kant's not pulling any punches here in what he thinks about the past. He is done with the past. He is rejecting the past. Inherited knowledge all needs to be interrogated in the Enlightenment. You cannot trust what people have said before you. Anything that comes to you in the form of tradition should be labeled superstition until it is tested with your own experimental methods, with your own ability to discern what is useful and what is not. And think about the number of developments that happen in this time. The quickest survey of the works of that era is mind-boggling, especially in the way it addresses human concerns. And if you look at the titles of the books that came out in that era, the Encyclopedia, Wealth of Nations, two treatises on government, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, Spinoza's Ethics, Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, the Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes, Descartes' Discourse on Method, and Newton's Principia. The scope of work there is really pretty astounding, and all of this is coming out by people who are simply leaving the past behind and saying, well, okay, what can we do now? The studies of these works are all about human civilization largely. How can we build on what we know to develop our lives on earth now, not worrying about heaven later, not worried about preserving the antiquities of the past, but looking at life with a very practical, pragmatic perspective. Now, the art of this era is particular. You come from a couple of different schools with this, and you can trace an awful lot of what is going on through the art. The Enlightenment art tends to evolve. It is a little bit sticky in the material forms. You get a school like Rococo or Rococo, depending on your pronunciation, which is very decorative. You have Jean-Honoré Fragonard's L'Escarpolette, and it is this very pretty, very flowery little episode of a young girl all dressed up, very pretty, very fancy, very aristocratic, it has to be said, on a swing, and it is so playful and so light. And this is an example of the kind of compartmentalization of pleasure. You could say that you can have a serious outlook for science if you just make room for this discrete little area of, decadence, a little lightheartedness before you go back to the lab and start experimenting. This is a way of controlling and creating something that allows the more serious utilitarian scope of your life. A little bit more didactic, a little bit more serious would be the neoclassical era. Neoclassical work comes like this, Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Socrates, which is a classical story, but here it is using, this painting is using that classical story to teach certain things. It is didactic. It is trying to teach people something of value. And here, David is giving a salute to the figure of Socrates on his deathbed, as he is about to drink the hemlock that will kill him and basically give birth to Western philosophy in the process. It is a moment of honor, it is a moment of intellectual integrity. Socrates is here not bowing to pressures to give up his philosophical activities. He is choosing to die as a part of his punishment for being prosecuted as a philosopher, and so it is a sign of the freedom of the mind. More literal expression of the age of reason and the spirit of inquiry can be seen in the work of the British painter Joseph Wright. His Philosopher Lecturing on the Ori uses a very dramatic chiaroscuro or tenebristic effect, which is that high contrast light and shadow. This style is used here to dramatize the study of a model of the planet's movement around the sun, a scientific experiment, if you will. A philosopher here would be a philosopher of science. And you can see the shade around it is so dark, but right in the center on this model is the source of light. It is illumined there. So the knowledge that is being demonstrated right there lights up everything. Well, it gradiates out from there into the shadow. Everything outside that experiment is shadow. Everything outside that model is shadow. It is basically an age of darkness, except in the scientific act. That light of knowledge is the light of the Enlightenment, and it warms everybody accordingly. And probably the most intense moment in that painting is the faces of the children down right at the center. Their full faces are enlightened, whereas everybody else, especially the adults, are in semi-shadow still and are further away from the light source. But this focus on the children tells us another key element of enlightenment, and that is the future. The Enlightenment is very concerned with making things better for the future, making an improvement now, making another one tomorrow, another one the day after that, until you can reach a plateau of human perfection. The idea of human perfectibility is very much part of the Enlightenment. Similar topic, however, you can see in the Dutch master Johannes Vermeer. His portrait of the astronomer celebrates that effort to understand the shape of the universe, to grapple with these problems, to think about that. And this one moment that he captures is a moment almost when you can see an idea being born. Look at that hand reaching towards that as the mind is starting to give shape to an idea. Significantly here, the scientist portrayed is a member of the middle class, broadly. He is not dressed particularly ornately or ensconced in luxurious surroundings. He is very pragmatic. He is very practical. He is 100% focused on his activity. He's not just a polite aristocratic dilettante playing around. He is engaged with this inquiry on a very serious level, and the value that's being expressed here is an appreciation for the intellectual activity itself, not necessarily the pedigree that it bears. Now, the art beyond that gets a little bit iffy, and there's not a lot of really great painting going on or sculpture going on in that era. In England, you get people like Reynolds who are doing portraits, trying to record how people look in that age, prettying them up a little bit, quite frankly. Reynolds was being paid by aristocrats who wanted to be made to look good. But if you want to find a more regularized expression of artistic and aesthetic sentiment of the age, you have to look more to architecture. And there you get the marriage of form and function. So it's not just about it being beautiful, it's about it being useful, quite frankly. The greatest expression of this is the palace at Versailles in France, developed by Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, a great avatar of the Enlightenment in his own way. Particularly, the buildings are phenomenal. The whole campus is mind-blowing. But just the easiest thing to get a sense of the Enlightenment spirit here would be to look at the gardens. The gardens are not like ordinary gardens that we would find anywhere, certainly in the States, but they are elaborately cultivated geometric shapes. The idea of a maze in a garden is largely a French creation. And here you can see these very intricate plantings. This is nothing overgrown. Everything is very scrupulously trimmed down to shape into geometric shapes. Geometry is part of the Enlightenment, quite frankly. Closer to the home, you can find an awful lot of architecture just looking at the big buildings of the American scene, most notably, let's say, the U.S. Capitol, also the White House, Thomas Jefferson's own home, Monticello in Virginia, which he himself mostly designed. But all of this is about uniting form and function. Nothing too ornate, nothing that is not designed to serve a purpose. And in the buildings of government, you see an effort to impress, to radiate a kind of strength and stability that you want from government, and the architecture tends to lead that way. The core idea of this aesthetic and this whole philosophy of life, I would say, is a very pragmatic one, and we get the best representation of it, the best voicing of it from the other great Enlightenment figure of the early American scene, and that is Ben Franklin, who, in his own letter to an English scientist, he was always writing to fellow scientists, and that was primarily his vocation in life, beyond helping found the U.S. government. It's his famous experiment with the key and the lightning and all that. But here, writing to a fellow scientist, Joseph Priestley, a more accomplished scientist than Franklin, frankly, he gives a near perfect encapsulation of the spirit of the age. Writing to Priestley, he says, "I always rejoice to hear of your being still employed in experimental researches into nature, and of the success you meet with. The rapid progress true science now makes occasions my regretting sometimes that I was born so soon. It is impossible to imagine the height to which may be carried in 1,000 years the power of man over matter. We may perhaps learn to deprive large masses of their gravity and give them absolute levity for the sake of easy transport. Agriculture may diminish its labor and double its produce. All diseases may by sure means be prevented or cured, not excepting even that of old age, and our lives lengthened at leisure even beyond the antediluvian standard. Oh, that moral science were in as fair a way of improvement, that men would cease to be wolves to one another, and that human beings would at length learn what they now improperly call humanity." Now, there's a lot there. I mean, the optimism of this, of the belief in human potential. Oh my God, if only I wasn't born so soon, because things are just getting good. It is a belief in the future. It is a belief in progress, in human perfectibility, in making things better, tinkering along the way. Franklin's a great tinkerer, and he is all for adjusting things as we move on and as we learn more. And he's regretting that he is, at this point, a very old man. He's going to be dead in another few years, and this is hard for him because he sees science taking so many remarkable steps. He imagines airplanes defying masses of their gravity for the sake of easy transport. He is imagining airplanes. He's talking about medicine. He is talking about agriculture. He's talking about all these things that over the next 150 years would be reality. And yes, he just happened to be born too soon for them. And then at the end, he gives that little caveat and he says, "Oh, that oh, that moral science were in as fair a way of improvement, that men would cease to be wolves to one another." Significantly, he is writing this in 1780. The Revolutionary War is still going on, and he is writing to Joseph Priestley, a Londoner, or at least an Englishman. And the reality of life is that human beings are often not perfectible. Human beings are a wrinkle in the formula of human perfectibility. And he is voicing that little doubt right there. And that would become much more of a problem as the Enlightenment plays out. He is just a couple of months past the launching of the French Revolution, which was a great experiment in Enlightenment ideas that goes very much awry. So there's a lot of history at play here. But for the most part, the Enlightenment is all about the spirit of discovery. And the two great mottos of that we have are both in Latin, which flies in the face of the movement's attitude towards past knowledge and received traditions. But the first comes from Immanuel Kant, whom we saw earlier, who launched the phrase sapere aude, which is dare to know. Have the courage to experiment. Have the courage to think. Freedom of thought. Chase your ideas vehemently and vigorously. Dare to know wherever those, whatever you have to challenge to chase your ideas. Dare to know. Sapere aude. And the other comes from our good friend Rene Descartes, de omnibus dubitandum, which is doubt everything. Somebody tells you something, ask for the proof. You see something, think about how it could be perceived otherwise. Doubt everything. Make no assumptions. Always test what you are seeing. This is the scientific method. Test, 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 test. Do not take anything on faith. Do not take anything just because, as gospel, just because some great tradition or authority hands it down to you. It's a troubling philosophy for practical matters in many respects. The ideas that get filtered down become revolutionary, lead to the French Revolution, even as some of the greatest cheerleaders of the Enlightenment were despots. Frederick was a great supporter of Enlightenment ideas, as so was Peter the Great in Russia, Catherine the Great in Russia, and yet still they are totalitarian autocrats and in some cases tyrants. So the ideas are fractious, the ideas are difficult, but the way they are expressed is so hopeful, so inspiring, and so clear. There is a clarity of expression that comes through the Enlightenment that is unlike anything that had ever come through before. More people are being brought into the world of culture because of this, because now the ideas are being expressed for clarity of thought rather than just artistry. It doesn't have to be so pretty, it just needs to be clear. Think about how many critical assumptions come through that era. How many ideas come through that era that are still with us today, and you can see the effect of this. It is a ennobling spirit in its own way, and it is a cold, clear glass of water to nourish yourself with after the wines of previous eras. It has its problems, but the art of the Enlightenment is stimulating on an intellectual level like few eras before it.